Did you know that in some winters, medieval peasants froze to death in their own beds, not outside in the fields, but under their thatched roofs, lying beside their families? In the morning, children sometimes woke to find a parent stiff and silent beside them. That's how brutal winter was. It didn't just starve people, it crept inside their homes, into their lungs, into their bones, and took them quietly in the night. Hey, tonight we're going deep into one of the bleakest truths of the Middle Ages. How peasants, the poorest, hardest working majority of medieval society, fought to survive freezing winters. Forget the cosy storybook images of glowing cottages and cheery snowfalls. The reality was mud, hunger, smoke-choked huts, and the constant fear that you wouldn't make it to spring. And before we begin, do me a favour. If you actually enjoy these strange midnight dives into the filthier side of history, hit that like button and subscribe. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is. It blows my mind to see people all over the world falling asleep while I tell stories that once kept entire villages awake at night. Now, pull your blanket a little tighter, because where we're going, even your warmest quilt wouldn't save you. Picture this. You wake in a medieval hut at the dead of winter. Your breath hangs in the air, every exhale a ghostly cloud. The straw mattress beneath you is damp and alive with lice. The roof leaks, dripping cold water onto your face. The fire, your only defence, has died in the night. In the corner, your water bucket is frozen solid. And you're not alone in bed. Your children are pressed against you, your spouse too, and sometimes even a goat or pig. Their body heat may be the only thing standing between you and death. The smell is unbearable, sweat, piss, manure, mildew. But winter doesn't care about dignity. Outside, snow buries the land in silence. The fields are dead, animals half-starved, and food stores already rotting with mould. Every breath you take tastes of smoke and cold. And every morning begins the same desperate way. Breaking ice just to drink, scraping frost from walls, and praying that somehow your thin firewood pile lasts until spring. If food was the stomach's enemy in winter, cold was the enemy of the body itself. In the medieval countryside, fire wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Without fire, peasants didn't simply shiver. They froze, their skin blistering from frostbite, their lungs stiffening in the icy night air. And yet, fire was always scarce, always fragile, always threatening to vanish. Peasant huts had no chimneys in the early Middle Ages. Smoke from the hearth simply curled upward, filling the room before it seeped out through holes in the thatch roof. That meant winter warmth came with a cost, choking on your own survival. Eyes watered constantly, lungs burned, and children grew up with coughs that never seemed to leave. If you stepped into a hut in midwinter, the first thing you noticed wasn't the warmth, it was the acrid sting of smoke. Keeping that fire alive was a relentless battle. Wood had to be cut, dried, and hoarded all summer, stacked carefully in whatever shed or lean-to peasants could manage. But wood was heavy. Cutting it meant hours in the forest, swinging axes with frozen hands, dragging logs through snow while wolves circled at the edges. Many peasants couldn't afford to own woodland. They scavenged instead, gathering twigs, stripping branches from hedgerows, even burning dung when nothing else was left. The smell of burning manure, acrid, bitter, clinging to hair and clothing, was the scent of survival. Firewood was so valuable that laws existed to regulate it. In some villages, peasants were forbidden from cutting live trees and could only scavenge fallen branches. Get caught breaking that rule, and you faced fines, beatings, or worse. But for a starving family, punishment was less frightening than another night in the cold. Many risked it anyway, creeping into forests at dawn with axes muffled in cloth. Even with firewood, warmth was rationed. A single hearth had to heat an entire family. Sometimes a dozen people huddled together in one smoky room. The fire burned low at night, embers covered with ash to keep them alive until morning. If it died, someone had to trudge through the snow to borrow flame from a neighbour. An embarrassing and dangerous task. To admit your fire had gone out was almost shameful. It meant you hadn't prepared, and in winter, shame could be fatal. Clothing offered little defence. Wool was precious but scratchy, full of lice. Linen shirts were thin, often patched until they looked like rags. Cloaks and hoods gave some warmth, but most peasants owned only one or two garments. They wore them day and night, until they rotted off their bodies. The poor often stuffed straw or moss into boots to fight frostbite. Gloves were rare, hands cracked and bled in the cold. And then there were the animals. Cows, goats, sheep and pigs weren't just food sources. They were living heaters. In many huts, livestock lived under the same roof as humans, separated by nothing more than a low wall or pile of straw. Their body heat added crucial degrees to the freezing air. But it also meant living with the stench of dung, the squeals of pigs, the bleating of goats. Imagine trying to sleep while your only blanket was the warmth of manure-steaming animals pressed beside you. Still, fire could betray as much as it saved. A spark too close to thatch, and an entire village could vanish in flames. Winter was especially deadly. When families crowded indoors, fuel piled high, and every spark threatened disaster. Chronicles tell of entire communities reduced to ash in one night. Peasants trapped inside huts as dry straw and timber ignited above their heads. Survivors sometimes froze to death in the snow outside, watching everything they owned burn to nothing. And yet, despite its risks, fire was sacred. It was prayed over, tended like a living being. Some believed letting the fire die angered household spirits. Others passed down rituals, spitting into flames for luck, tossing in salt to keep witches away. Children grew up knowing that to play too close to the hearth wasn't just dangerous, it was sinful. Fire was life, but fire was also division. Wealthier peasants, or those close to lords, could afford better wood, thicker walls, maybe even iron grates to manage sparks. The poorest had almost nothing, smoky piles of damp brushwood that smouldered more than they burned. For them, winter meant constant cold. Bodies huddled tight, breath freezing on lips, toes blackening from frostbite. Picture it, a medieval family in January. The father crouches over the hearth, coaxing weak flames from damp logs. The mother presses her children close, wrapping them in the only wool cloak the family owns. Outside, the snow crunches as a wolf prowls too near the hut. Inside, the smoke chokes the room, eyes streaming, throats burning. And still, everyone leans toward the little flame, because without it, there'll be corpses by morning. Fire wasn't luxury, it wasn't comfort. It was a fragile line between survival and the grave. And every winter, countless peasants watched that line flicker dangerously close to darkness. If cold was one enemy of the medieval peasant, hunger was the other. Winter stripped the land bare, and once the last harvest was tucked away in autumn, every family knew the same terrible truth. The food pile would only shrink, and for most it would shrink too fast. The diet of a peasant in winter was grim. Bread, coarse, heavy, made with rye or barley instead of wheat, was the staple. But it wasn't the fluffy loaf you might imagine. It was dark, dense, often laced with husks and grit from millstones. Bite into it, and you could chip a tooth. Mould often crept into loaves stored too long. Still, it was better than nothing. Vegetables came from root cellars: turnips, parsnips, onions, cabbage. Stored in pits or buried under straw, they lasted but barely. By midwinter, many were shriveled, soft and foul-smelling. Cabbage rotted into slime. Carrots shrank until they were rubbery sticks. But peasants ate them anyway, gagging down the taste. Protein was a luxury. Meat, usually pork, sometimes mutton or beef, had to be slaughtered and salted in autumn, stored in barrels, layered with brine. By January, the salt turned meat tough, the taste almost unbearable. Still, families gnawed at it carefully, stretching every scrap. The poor rarely saw meat at all. They boiled bones for broth, scraped fat from hides, and chewed gristle like gum. Sometimes they turned to fish, dried or smoked, but inland villages had little access. Eggs were rare in winter, hens too cold to lay. Milk dried up as animals grew lean. Butter and cheese existed only for the wealthier households. Poorer peasants dreamed of them. By February, most larders were nearly empty. Peasants turned desperate. They ground acorns, chestnuts, even weeds into flour, baking bitter bread that twisted stomachs. Some gathered tree bark, scraping the inner layers to boil into thin soup. In years of famine, people were reported to eat cats, dogs, even rats. Chronicles whisper of cannibalism during the harshest winters. Entire families found dead. Their neighbours whispering about the missing meat. Food wasn't just scarce, it was dangerous. Spoiled grain brought disease. Rye infected with ergot fungus caused hallucinations, convulsions, even death. Imagine eating bread one night and waking with your limbs burning, skin blackening as if cursed. Villagers called it St. Anthony's fire, but hunger made people eat it anyway, even knowing the risk. The fear of famine haunted everyone. Lords demanded their share of crops as rent, leaving peasants with barely enough to survive. Taxes weren't suspended for winter. A family could starve while sacks of grain sat locked in a manor cellar. Rebellions sometimes sparked not from politics, but from empty bellies. Communal feasts were rare sparks of relief. At Christmas or midwinter festivals, villages pooled what they had: a pig slaughtered, ale brewed, bread baked. For one night, stomachs were full, but the next day, hunger returned, sharper than before. Children suffered most. Their bellies bloated with malnutrition, their arms thin as sticks. Many didn't survive the cold months. Mothers wept quietly, holding limp bodies, then forced themselves to eat, because wasting food on grief meant other children would die too. Imagine a February evening. A family sits in their hut, the fire barely alive, a pot simmering with watery soup. Inside float a few turnips, some onion skins, a scrap of salted pork. The smell is sour, thin, unappetizing. They pass around coarse bread, black with mould. The father chews slowly, hiding his hunger so his children can eat. The youngest cries for more, but there is none. Outside, the snow presses against the walls, like an enemy. For medieval peasants, winter meals weren't nourishment. They were survival measured in crumbs. And every night, as they licked their bowls clean, they wondered the same question: would the food last until spring? Cold and hunger were killers on their own. But winter in the medieval village came with another curse: sickness. The cramped huts, the choking smoke, the rotting food, all of it made disease thrive, and peasants, without doctors or medicine, endured it helplessly. Step into a hut in January. The fire smoulders, but the air is thick with smoke. Children cough endlessly, their chests rattling. The old wheeze in the corner, eyes watering. Every surface is damp with condensation. Straw floors soaked with mud, piss and manure. The animals penned inside add their stench to the air, and with it lice and fleas. The smell alone is enough to make you gag, a mixture of wet wool, spoiled food, unwashed bodies and dung. In this swamp of filth, sickness was inevitable. Colds were constant, so were fevers, but the real killers were infections. A simple cut from chopping wood could fester into a swollen, pus-dripping wound. With no antiseptics, no bandages beyond dirty cloth, the infection spread through the body. Peasants called it the rot. To them it was fate. To us it was septicemia. Lungs were especially vulnerable. Smoke-filled huts caused constant bronchitis, pneumonia, even tuberculosis. A winter cough could linger for months, wasting away the weak. Children hacked until their ribs ached, their faces pale and thin. Many never recovered. Then there were the parasites. Lice thrived in unwashed hair, fleas infested straw bedding. Worms grew inside bellies from contaminated food. Children scratched constantly, their skin raw with sores. Adults grew gaunt, their strength drained by unseen invaders. Some peasants joked bitterly that they weren't starving alone. Their worms were eating too. Food poisoning was another killer. Spoiled meat, mouldy bread, rancid fat. Peasants ate it anyway. Desperate. Stomachs cramped, diarrhea struck. Dehydration followed. In the dead of winter, when water was frozen and scarce, these illnesses could kill in days. Imagine squatting in a freezing corner of a hut, body racked with sickness, while your family pretends not to notice. There was no privacy, no dignity, only suffering in the open. Epidemics sometimes swept through villages. Typhus, spread by lice, raged in winters when people huddled close. Dysentery spread through dirty water. And though the Great Plague years were still centuries away for many medieval peasants, outbreaks of lesser-known pestilences struck often enough to leave piles of corpses in the snow. Healing practices were primitive. Peasants relied on herbs, garlic for lungs, nettles for fever, honey for wounds. Sometimes they worked, often they didn't. When illness worsened, shamans or wise women muttered prayers, burned herbs or applied charms. Illness was seen as punishment, from God, from spirits, from ancestors. The cure was penance, prayer, endurance. The stench of sickness filled huts as much as the smoke. Rotting breath from diseased gums, the sour smell of diarrhea, the sharp tang of blood. To be alive in winter was to inhale the stink of death daily. And yet people endured. They wrapped sores in rags, drank bitter herbal teas, and prayed through coughing fits. They buried their children in frozen ground, carved crosses into the snow, and carried on. Because they had no choice. Imagine lying in a straw bed, fever burning, sweat soaking your ragged tunic. Your mother dips cloth into icy water and presses it to your forehead. She whispers prayers while goats bleat nearby. Outside, snow buries the fields. Inside, death waits as patiently as the frost. For peasants, disease was not extraordinary. It was expected. Winter meant hunger, cold and filth, but above all, it meant sickness. And the line between the living and the dead grew thinner, with every freezing, coughing night. When winter pressed hardest, when food was nearly gone, firewood burned down to stubs, and bellies ached from emptiness, peasants had to improvise. Survival was never a clean story of resourcefulness. It was ugly, desperate, and sometimes downright humiliating. One common trick was stretching bread. Grain was precious, and by February, most families had little left. To make loaves last, they mixed flour with anything. Ground acorns, chestnuts, tree bark, straw. The bread came out bitter, heavy, and barely digestible. Some loaves were more filler than food, leaving stomachs bloated but still starving. Rats ate better than peasants some years, chewing through what little grain was left in the bins. Others turned to foraging, even in the snow. Women scraped moss from rocks, dug frozen roots with sticks, or boiled pine needles for a weak tea. Children were sent out to collect anything edible. Berries left shriveled on bushes. Dead birds dropped from frost, even insects hiding under bark. Hunger didn't allow disgust. Meat was so rare that even carrion was eaten. A frozen deer carcass, half eaten by wolves, became a prize. Peasants hacked off whatever was left, cooked it black over fire, and swallowed it gratefully. Chronicles describe families gnawing on horse hides, softening leather in water until it could be chewed. And then there were rituals. Desperation often turned spiritual. Some peasants believed hanging animal skulls over doorways kept hunger away. Others burned herbs, not for medicine, but to chase spirits blamed for sickness and famine. Families sometimes gathered at night to chant, dance, or beg saints for relief. In pagan corners of Europe, offerings were still made to old gods. A scrap of meat tossed into the fire, a whispered prayer to the forest. But rituals didn't fill bellies. The ugliest coping mechanism of all was theft. When food ran low, peasants stole from each other. Neighbours raided grain bins, pilfered meat from drying racks, even dug into cellars at night. Families built hidden pits or buried food under manure piles to disguise their stores. If caught stealing, punishments were brutal. Beatings, exile, sometimes death. Yet hunger pushed people beyond fear. In rare, terrible winters, stories emerged of cannibalism. Chronicles hint at it carefully, but the meaning is clear. Bodies missing from graves, rumours of strange meat cooked in pots. Parents abandoned children they could not feed. Orphans froze in the snow, their small bodies stripped of clothing by the desperate. These were extremes, but they happened often enough that whispers lingered for centuries. Even fire had its coping tricks. When wood ran out, people burned anything: old furniture, broken tools, even dung. The smell of burning manure clung to clothing and hair, filling huts with acrid smoke that burned lungs. Ashes were sometimes reused to stretch food, stirred into porridge to make it look thicker. Clothing was patched endlessly. Old cloaks were cut into strips, stitched into new tunics, stuffed with straw for insulation. Boots were stuffed with moss or rags. Children wore their parents' cast-offs, sleeves dragging on the ground. Holes were filled with whatever was at hand: scraps of leather, sinew, even rawhide cut from dead animals. Some coping strategies were communal. Villagers sometimes pooled resources, slaughtering a pig and sharing the meat, holding feasts to raise morale. But solidarity had limits. When hunger sharpened, every family thought of their own survival first. Alliances cracked, and kindness turned to suspicion. Imagine it, a February night in a snowbound village. Families crouch in huts, chewing bread made of bark and straw. Outside, a man sneaks to his neighbour's cellar, hoping to steal a handful of grain. Across the village, a woman rocks a crying child, whispering to saints, though her prayers are as empty as her belly. The smell of dung smoke lingers, heavy, suffocating. In the dark, wolves howl, but the real predators are hunger and cold. Medieval peasants didn't cope with winter the way we imagine. They endured it, scraping survival from filth, theft, prayer, and desperation. Winter wasn't a season, it was an executioner, and every year peasants prayed it would pass them by. For all the filth and hunger, medieval peasants knew one truth: nobody survived winter alone. A family could huddle in a smoky hut for weeks, but without a village, without neighbours, they were doomed. Winter was communal by necessity, and yet beneath the surface of cooperation, Desperation always waited to tear bonds apart. At the start of the cold season, villages often planned together. Men helped each other chop wood, dragging great logs from the forest before snow buried the paths. Women gathered late crops side by side, sharing baskets of turnips and onions, gossiping even as their hands froze. The communal oven was central. Peasants couldn't afford fuel for private baking, so they used one great village oven, bringing dough to be baked in long shifts. The smell of fresh bread was one of the few winter luxuries. Work was shared. When roofs laked under snow, neighbours patched them with straw. When animals grew sick, men hauled them together into warmer shelters. When someone's fire went out, they borrowed embers from the hearth next door. A hut with fire meant survival for more than one family. But cooperation was fragile. Hunger had a way of breaking bonds. In lean years, villagers watched one another with suspicion. Who had grain hidden? Who had salted meat in their cellar? Neighbours spied on neighbours, whispering about thefts, sometimes accusing innocent families. Fights broke out over a loaf of bread or a single sack of turnips. Still, solidarity persisted in ritual. At Christmas or during midwinter feasts, the village came together. The Lord might distribute ale or a little meat, and families feasted for a night, dancing around fires, pretending life was generous. The next day the hunger was worse, but for one night there was laughter. Villagers also shared protection. Wolves, desperate with hunger, prowled close to huts, their howls piercing the dark. Alone, a family could be dragged down. Together, men drove them back with torches and spears, shouting until the pack scattered. Raiders, too, sometimes struck during harsh winters, stealing food or animals. A lone hut was defenceless, but a village with sharpened stakes and watchful men could resist. Religion bound communities tightly. Priests led prayers against famine, blessing fields buried under snow. Processions sometimes marched through frozen villages, crosses raised high, chanting against hunger. When children died, as so many did, the entire village gathered for burials, stamping their feet in the frozen earth, lowering small bodies into shallow graves. Grief was collective, not private, and yet winter tested faith. Some blamed neighbours for famine, whispering of witchcraft. An unlucky widow might be accused of cursing crops. Her hut vandalised, her name spat in the snow. Misfortune demanded a scapegoat, and the starving were quick to find one. Imagine a night in late January. Snow heaps against the huts, wind shrieks through the thatch. In the communal hall, families gather around a single fire. A pig is roasted, divided into tiny portions. Children laugh for the first time in weeks. Men tell stories, women hum songs. But outside, in the dark, a man slips into his neighbour's shed to steal grain. Inside, trust warms the group. Outside, suspicion festers. This was the paradox of medieval winter. You needed your community to survive, yet hunger and cold could turn that community into your enemy. Solidarity and betrayal lived side by side, like fire and smoke, and every winter, peasants hoped the fire burned brighter than the smoke. When the night stretched endless and the cold sank deep into bone, medieval peasants leaned on faith and fear to keep going. Religion wasn't separate from life. It was woven into every cough, every frost-bitten toe, every empty stomach. Winter wasn't just weather. It was a spiritual battle. Church bells rang over snowbound villages, muffled by drifts but still heavy with meaning. Priests reminded peasants that winter was God's trial, a season meant to test patience and endurance, survive faithfully, and spring would come. Fail and punishment awaited both in this world and the next. People clung to this promise because otherwise the endless cold seemed unbearable. But official religion was only half the story. Beneath the sermons, peasants carried older, stranger beliefs, superstitions that had survived Christianity's spread. Many still whispered about spirits in the snow, demons in the howling wind, witches who could curse food stores. Some believed frost itself was alive, a malevolent force that crept under doors and smothered families in their sleep. To fight this, peasants performed rituals. Ash was sprinkled at thresholds to ward off evil. Bread crusts were tossed into the fire as offerings. Candles were lit not just for light, but as shields against darkness that seemed more than natural. Families placed charms, carved crosses, animal bones, bits of herbs, above doors and hearths, hoping to keep unseen forces at bay. Seasonal festivals became acts of defiance. At Christmas and Candlemas, peasants gathered for processions, carrying torches through frozen fields, singing to banish demons of hunger and cold. Sometimes they dressed in costumes of fur and horns, scaring away spirits with noise and fire. Children laughed, but the adults knew the truth. The spectacle wasn't entertainment. It was desperation made ritual. Superstitions could also turn cruel. When food rotted or animals sickened, someone had to be blamed. Accusations of witchcraft often fell on widows, beggars, or outsiders. A woman seen muttering near a barn might be accused of freezing milk in cows' udders or cursing grain bins. She could be beaten, driven from the village, or worse. Hunger demanded a scapegoat, and faith provided one. Dreams were another source of terror. A nightmare of wolves prowling the hut might be taken as a sign of raiders. Dreams of black smoke meant famine. Dreams of ancestors meant warnings. Shamans or wise women interpreted these visions, charging in bread or ale for their counsel. People woke shaking, convinced their very dreams were omens. And always, the church loomed. Priests demanded tithes even in winter, taking grain from starving families. Yet they also offered hope, blessings on fields, prayers for health, the promise of spring resurrection. Many peasants both resented and relied on the church, kneeling in frozen chapels, their breath clouding the air as they prayed to saints for mercy. Imagine a February night. A family huddles by a dying fire. The father whispers a pater noster. The mother clutches a wooden rosary, and the children sleep with charms of bone around their necks. Outside, the wind screams like voices, wolves howl, the snow creaks with unseen movement. Every sound is a threat, every shadow a demon. And yet, the prayers keep them steady, even as their stomachs gnaw with hunger. Faith gave peasants structure, but also chains. It told them suffering was holy. Hunger was a test and survival was a reward from God. It gave them hope, but it also justified their misery. For peasants, winter was never just about cold. It was about evil forces pressing at the door, divine punishment falling from the sky, and fragile rituals standing between them and despair. When snow buried the fields and icy winds howled across the countryside, most peasants were trapped inside their huts. You might think shelter meant safety, but for peasants, being stuck indoors was often just as brutal as the world outside. Picture the scene. A single smoky room, maybe 12 feet across, with walls of wattle and daub, already cracking under the cold. The roof leaks with every thaw, dripping icy water onto straw bedding. The floor is mud mixed with manure, frozen into ridges. Smoke fills the air because there is no chimney, only a hole in the roof. Eyes sting, throats burn, lungs ache. Coughing becomes the background noise of survival. Whole families lived in this space, often with animals. Goats bleated in one corner, Pigs snorted in another. Chickens fluttered overhead on makeshift rafters. Their body heat was precious, but their filth was unavoidable. Dung piled up, sometimes frozen, sometimes thawed into reeking sludge. Children crawled in it, bare feet blackened, hair crawling with lice. Privacy didn't exist. Husbands and wives quarrelled in front of children. Couples shared straw bedding with goats bleating inches away. Every cough, every bowel movement, every groan of hunger echoed in the same confined space. Arguments flared easily, over food, over chores, over whether someone had stolen an extra crust of bread. In winter, tempers were as sharp as the frost. Parasites thrived in these conditions. Fleas leapt from animals to humans. Lice spread through bedding and clothing. Worms infested guts, leaving bellies bloated while bodies wasted away. Scratching was constant. Children tore their skin bloody. Mothers picked lice from hair by the fire. Fathers slapped fleas off their legs. And there was no escape. Even when snow melted, huts were still pits of infestation. Cooking was primitive. A single pot hung over the hearth, into which anything edible was thrown. Grain, roots, scraps of meat, sometimes even weeds. The result was a perpetual stew, ladled day after day, with new ingredients added as old ones rotted away. The smell was sour, greasy, smoky. Meals were eaten with wooden spoons, everyone dipping into the same pot. Hygiene didn't exist. The cold still found ways in. Draughts sliced through cracks in the walls. Frost crept along beams. Water froze inside buckets. Families piled straw along door frames, stuffed rags into gaps, even plastered mud with bare hands to keep the wind out. Still, the cold pressed closer every night, nipping fingers and toes. Frostbite blackened skin. Toes dropped off in the dark, and hands stiffened until they could barely hold tools. Boredom gnawed as much as hunger. Days were short, nights endless. With little to do outside, families sat in gloom, repairing clothes, weaving rope, carving wood, or simply staring at the fire. Children fidgeted, fought, and cried. Parents snapped in frustration. Violence sometimes erupted, not from malice, but from the sheer strain of being trapped in filth and fear for months on end. Yet within the misery, there were rituals of endurance. Women told stories to children, fairy tales of saints or monstrous beasts beyond the forest. Men sang songs or recited prayers. Families played simple games, tossing bones, guessing riddles, even gambling scraps of food. Laughter, though rare, could still cut through the suffocating smoke. But winter indoors wasn't gentle togetherness. It was a test of patience, a battle against filth, and a slow grind of survival. Imagine trying to sleep as smoke stings your eyes, goats piss in the corner, lice crawl in your hair, and your stomach growls from hunger. That was a normal night for medieval peasants. The hut kept out the snow, but it trapped every other misery inside. If winter was brutal for adults, it was merciless for children. The smallest bodies were always the first to falter, and in a medieval village, childhood was often little more than a brief gamble against hunger, frost and disease. From the moment the snow began to fall, infants were in constant danger. Born in huts with no heat beyond the hearth, swaddled in rags still damp from smoke and sweat, many newborns never survived their first winter. A single night without fire could leave a baby blue and still in the morning. Mothers tried to keep them alive with body heat, pressing them to their bare skin, but even that wasn't always enough. For toddlers and small children, survival meant clinging to their parents. They huddled in straw beds beside animals, shivering under coarse wool blankets. Their bellies were usually empty, their cheeks hollow. Malnutrition showed quickly. Swollen bellies, stick-thin arms, hair falling out in clumps, coughs rattled through their chests constantly. Many grew too weak to stand, yet children still worked. By age 4 or 5, they fetched sticks for fuel, scraped frost off buckets, scared crows from dwindling grain stores. Small hands meant they could crawl into tight spaces to collect eggs or dig frozen roots. They had no childhood as we know it, just miniature survival. Their play reflected this. Games weren't toys in warm rooms, but scraps of survival turned into amusement. A carved stick became a spear. Bones became dice. Frozen dung was thrown like snowballs. Children laughed, but their games were also practice. Pretending to hunt, pretending to carry wood, pretending to guard animals. Childhood was training for a life that might never come. But sickness stalked constantly. Worms bloated bellies. Fevers burned hot in frail bodies. Smoke from the hearth scarred their lungs. Many children coughed themselves to death before reaching 10. Mothers sat rocking them in their arms, whispering prayers as life slipped away. Burials of the young were so common that small graves dotted the frozen earth around every village. Despite the misery, children were precious. Parents, even exhausted and starving, carved wooden trinkets, tied little charms around necks, sang lullabies in smoky huts. Families huddled together, trying to give warmth where food could not. Hope rested in the children's survival because they were the only promise of a future. Imagine a January night. A child stirs restlessly under a ragged blanket, coughing weakly. The mother pulls the child close, her own belly empty, but her body warm. The father tosses another stick on the fire, though the pile beside the hearth is nearly gone. Outside, wolves howl. Inside, the only sound is the rattle of the child's breath. In the morning, the blanket may cover one less body. Some children survived, hardened by cold and hunger, but many did not. In some winters, villages buried more children than they saved. Life was cruel, and childhood in truth was little more than survival until you could swing an axe or bear a child of your own. Winter didn't just test children, it culled them. To understand how peasants endured medieval winters, you have to picture their huts not just as homes for people, but as barns for animals too. Cows, goats, sheep, and pigs were not left outside in the snow. They came in. They lived under the same roof, pressed into the same foul air, and that strange arrangement was both salvation and suffering. Livestock were wealth. A single cow meant milk, butter, and in dire times meat. Sheep gave wool, goats gave milk, pigs fattened for slaughter. Losing animals to the cold could doom a family as surely as losing a child. So when the snow fell, the animals were brought inside. A hut that already felt cramped with 6 people now had 3 goats and a pig added to the mess. Their bodies steamed in the cold, their heat raising the temperature just enough to keep humans alive. But their filth was constant. Dung piled in corners, urine soaked into straw, thawing and freezing again into a reeking paste. The air grew heavy, acrid, almost choking. To step inside was to gag. Chickens roosted on beams overhead, dropping filth onto bedding. Dog, half tame, half wild, slunk near the fire, stealing scraps. Cats stalked the shadows, catching rats that gnawed through grain bins. It was chaos, squawking, bleating, braying, oinking, all packed into a single smoky room. This mingling wasn't just disgusting, it was dangerous. Diseases passed easily between animals and humans. Fleas from pigs bit children. Lice thrived on sheep and spread to bedding. Milk soured quickly in the smoky air, often carrying bacteria that sickened families. Wounds festered faster in filth, and yet without the animals, peasants froze. The arrangement created odd intimacy. Families talked to animals, sang to them, treated them almost as household members. Children grew up clutching goats for warmth, sleeping against dogs, playing with piglets in the muck. But when hunger deepened, affection turned cold. Animals became food. A pig that had shared your floor all winter might be slaughtered in March, its squeals echoing through the village. Children cried, but survival allowed no sentiment. The line between animal and human blurred in other ways. Families relied on animals' behaviour as warnings. If dogs howled at night, raiders might be near. If cows grew restless, a storm was coming. Chickens refusing to lay were seen as omens of famine. Animals weren't just livestock. They were guardians, prophets, sometimes scapegoats, but the cost of this closeness was filth. Imagine lying in a straw bed, your children curled against you, while a cow shifts in the corner, farting hot clouds of stink into the already smoky air. Pigs root through the straw, grunting and squealing. Chickens flap above your head. Fleas bite your ankles. Every breath tastes of smoke, dung and sweat. And still, you are grateful, because without these animals, the cold would already have killed you. The peasants' huts in winter were not homes as we know them. They were survival chambers, human and beast crammed together. Bodies pressed against bodies, stench choking, but warmth just enough to cling to life. For medieval peasants, winter meant sharing your roof with everything you owned, every creature you depended on, every stink you couldn't escape. Survival was never clean. It was filthy, noisy, and alive. Not every winter was the same. Some were merely miserable, others were catastrophic. When the harvest failed in autumn, winter became something darker. Not just hunger, but famine. And famine had a way of showing just how thin the line between life and death really was. A poor harvest could happen for many reasons. Too much rain-rotted grain in the fields. Drought shriveled crops before they ripened. Early frosts killed plants before they could be stored. When that happened, everyone knew what was coming. Winter would not just be lean, it would be deadly. By January the signs were clear. Bread shrank to smaller and smaller slices, stretched with sawdust, straw, or even ground up weeds. Children were given broth so thin it was little more than hot water. Mothers pretended to eat, only to push their share to their children. Fathers chewed leather scraps, softening them in water until their jaws ached, trying to trick their bellies into thinking they'd eaten. As famine deepened, communities unravelled. Theft increased. Grain bins were raided in the night. Accusations of hoarding tore villages apart. In some cases, lords locked their stores away, feeding themselves while peasants starved outside their manor walls. Desperation bred anger. In certain winters, bands of peasants rioted, storming barns, seizing animals, demanding bread. The punishments were brutal: hangings, beatings, exile, but hunger silenced fear. The chronicles are filled with horror. One story tells of peasants boiling grass and moss to eat, their stomachs swelling painfully before they died. Others describe families eating cats, dogs, even rats pulled from barns. In the harshest winters, whispers of cannibalism spread. Graves were disturbed, corpses gone missing. Mothers were said to abandon infants to save older children. Priests prayed harder, but even their bellies growled in the cold. These famine years left scars. Whole villages sometimes disappeared, abandoned when too many died. Survivors moved on, seeking food in nearby towns or joining roving bands of beggars. Children orphaned by starvation wandered roads, their ribs showing, hair falling out, begging for crumbs. Some collapsed in snowdrifts and were never seen again. Yet famine also brought strange solidarity. In some villages, families pooled what little food they had, deciding together who would eat and who would starve. Elders sometimes gave up their portions willingly, lying down by the fire to die quietly so that children might live. These sacrifices became stories retold for generations, proof of both the cruelty and nobility of winter. Imagine the silence of a starving village. No laughter, no singing, no barking dogs, just the sound of wind and the creak of empty barns. Families lie motionless in smoky huts, too weak to speak. Children whimper faintly, their voices fading. Outside, snow buries everything, indifferent to the suffering below. When spring finally arrived after a famine winter, survival didn't mean relief. Bodies were weak, fields bare, seed grain eaten. Planting was nearly impossible, and famine often stretched into another year. Starvation wasn't a season, it was a cycle, threatening to repeat until entire communities vanished. For medieval peasants, the starvation winter wasn't legend or exaggeration. It was a recurring nightmare, one that haunted every autumn harvest. Because no matter how hard they worked, no matter how carefully they stored, one bad year could destroy them all. Cold and hunger were killers, but darkness was its own kind of torment. In medieval Europe, winter nights stretched painfully long. The sun dipped early, leaving villages cloaked in black for 14 or even 16 hours. With no electricity, no lamps beyond smoky tallow candles, people lived half their lives swallowed by night. And darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was fear, loneliness, and madness all wrapped together. The hut at night was a strange prison. Once the last spark of fire dimmed, shadows swallowed everything. The smoky walls pressed closer, every creak magnified, every rustle from the animals sounding like a threat. Children whimpered, clutching at their mothers, while men lay awake listening to the howling of wolves outside. To peasants, darkness was not neutral. It was alive. Superstitions thrived in the long night. Some believed demons crept through cracks in the walls. Witches were said to walk in storms. Their curses carried on the wind. Ghosts of the dead supposedly lingered in snow-covered fields, knocking on hut walls or calling names in the dark. Even priests admitted the devil prowled most easily in winter, when hunger and despair made souls weak. Every sound outside, a crunch of snow, a snapping branch, was a reminder that the unseen was watching. Sleep came in broken stretches. People didn't sleep in neat 8-hour blocks, but in 2 or 3 chunks, waking in the middle of the night to tend fires, feed babies, or pray against fear. These watches of wakefulness were filled with stories and whispered prayers. Parents told children tales of saints battling demons, or old pagan legends of sun gods returning each spring. Stories were survival. Without them, the silence would crush. Candles, when available, offered weak reprieve, but tallow stank, dripping grease and smoke. Candles were precious too, often saved for religious rituals or emergencies. Most nights, peasants relied on firelight alone, a sputtering glow that flickered, died, and left them staring into blackness. Darkness also warped time. Long nights blurred into each other, days short and dreamlike. Depression was common, though peasants didn't have that word. They called it melancholy, a heaviness of spirit. Some sat silently for hours, refusing to eat, staring at the fire until it burned out. Others grew irritable, snapping at family, lashing out at children. The endless, dark, frayed tempers gnawed at sanity. Yet not all was despair. The long nights also forged bonds. Families shared songs, prayers, even jokes in the smoke-thick dark. Couples whispered together under blankets, not out of romance, but to distract themselves from the howls outside. Children invented games, tossing bones or drawing shapes in the soot on walls. Darkness made life smaller, tighter, but sometimes also more intimate. Imagine lying awake at midnight. The fire has dwindled to embers. The hut is pitch black, filled with the smell of smoke and manure. You hear the snore of your father, the cough of your sister, the shifting of animals. Outside, wolves howl, and the wind rattles the walls. You clutch a wooden charm in your hand, whispering a prayer to keep demons away. This is not rest, this is endurance. For medieval peasants, darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a season in itself, a constant trial of fear and patience, and like the cold and hunger, it tested who would survive until spring. As if hunger, cold and darkness weren't enough, medieval peasants also had to share winter with beasts, and those beasts were just as desperate to survive. Wolves, boars, even bears stalked the frozen woods, and when their own food supplies ran out, they came closer to human huts, turning villages into battlefields of man against nature. The wolf was the most feared. Winter turned wolves from cautious scavengers into predators bold enough to circle villages. Packs howled all night, their voices echoing across snow-covered fields, sending chills down every spine. A lone traveller returning from the forest could vanish into the dark, his body later found torn apart, his bones scattered on the ice. Children were warned never to wander far from huts, not only because of frostbite, but because wolves were waiting. Chronicles tell of packs attacking livestock pens, dragging off sheep or goats, sometimes even breaking into huts when hunger drove them mad. Families woke to snarls at the door, men grabbing spears or torches, women screaming as wolves lunged from the dark. Some nights, the smell of blood lingered in the snow until dawn. Boars, too, were dangerous. Starving and enraged, they tore through frozen ground in search of roots, attacking anyone who came too close. A tusk could rip open a man's belly, spilling him into the snow before he could cry for help. Hunting them was risky, but sometimes necessary, as their meat could feed a family for weeks. Peasants set crude traps, dug pits, or drove them into nets, all while praying the beast didn't turn on them first. Bears were rarer in winter, often hibernating, but those that woke hungry were nightmares. A bear raiding a food store could destroy an entire family's supplies in a single night. Men armed with spears and axes stood no real chance against its bulk. If it came, survival meant flight, abandoning huts, letting the beast take what it wanted, and hoping it moved on. Even smaller animals made life miserable. Foxes raided chicken coops, weasels slipped into barns, slaughtering more animals than they could eat, leaving bodies scattered. Rats, bold in hunger, gnawed through wooden bins, spoiling grain with droppings. Cats fought them, but infestations were constant. The relationship between peasants and animals was complicated. They feared them, but they also depended on them. Wolves were cursed, yet their fur was prized if killed. Boars were dangerous, yet their meat was a treasure. Even rats, despised as pests, were sometimes eaten when famine struck. Survival erased clear lines of love and hate. Hunting in winter was a gamble. Men went into forests with crude bows, spears, or clubs, following tracks in the snow. If lucky, they returned with a deer or wild pig. If not, they returned empty-handed, or didn't return at all. Snow concealed dangers, hidden pits, thin ice, predators waiting. Hunters sometimes froze to death, lost in storms, and yet the risk had to be taken, because without fresh meat, families starved. Superstitions wrapped around animals too. Wolves were said to be servants of the devil, their howls omens of death. Boars were symbols of wrath, sometimes blamed for famine. Bears were seen as half human, their strength almost supernatural. Killing one wasn't just dangerous, it was spiritually loaded. Some villages celebrated such kills with rituals, feasts, and charms, as if to balance the violence with reverence. Imagine standing guard outside your hut on a January night. The snow glitters under the moon, your breath steaming in the cold. From the forest comes a long, mournful howl, answered by another and another. Your goats shuffle nervously behind the wall, their eyes wide. You grip your torch tighter, knowing the wolves are closer than ever. In the distance, you hear branches snapping, not the wind, but something heavier, moving closer. Your family sleeps inside unaware, and you know that if the fire burns out, the beasts will come. For medieval peasants, the forest in winter was never silent. It was filled with eyes watching from the dark, claws scratching the ice, hunger pressing against the edge of the village. The animals suffered the cold just as humans did, and that made them more dangerous than ever. In medieval villages, death was never far away, but in winter it seemed to sit in every corner of every hut. Hunger hollowed cheeks, frost gnawed fingers and toes, disease bloomed in the damp, smoke-filled air. Families lived with death as with another housemate, unwelcome but inevitable. Sometimes it was sudden. A man chopping wood collapsed in the snow, his body stiff before anyone found him. A child slipped on ice, cracked a skull, and was gone by dusk. An old woman fell asleep by the fire and never woke, her lips blue, her body stiff. Other times it was slow, starvation, sickness, weeks of coughing until a thin body wasted away. Death came in the night, most often. Families woke to silence, reaching for a child or elder, only to find them cold, stiff, and pale in the straw bed. There was no screaming, no drama, just the quiet weight of loss. In huts where space was scarce, the dead sometimes lay beside the living until morning light. Moving them in darkness was too dangerous, too cold. Burials were grim affairs. The ground was frozen solid, too hard to dig. Men hacked with axes and picks, sweat freezing on their brows, trying to carve shallow pits through ice and earth. Sometimes graves were little more than holes scraped in snow. Bodies covered hastily until spring thaw allowed proper burial. Crosses were erected, but often they toppled under snowdrifts, leaving graves anonymous. Death was so common that grief often looked different than we imagine. Tears were shed, prayers whispered, but life had to continue. Animals needed tending, fires needed feeding, food needed finding. A family might bury a child in the morning and still gather dung for fuel by afternoon. Survival didn't allow long mourning, yet rituals mattered. Priests read hurried prayers over frozen bodies. Families placed tokens with the dead, a rosary, a carved cross, sometimes a bit of bread or grain for the afterlife. Children tucked wooden toys into graves. Belief in heaven was a balm, the promise that the dead had escaped the suffering of winter for eternal warmth. But fear lingered. Some believed the restless dead could rise in winter, their spirits wandering villages, angry at being buried in shallow snow. People placed stones over graves or whispered charms to keep the dead from returning. Wolves and dogs sometimes dug at burial mounds, scattering bones, adding terror to grief. Imagine it, a bleak January morning. Men struggle with picks in frozen soil, their breaths white clouds in the air. Women stand nearby, clutching children, their faces blank with exhaustion. A small body wrapped in cloth waits to be lowered, the cries of the mother muffled by the wind. In the distance, bells toll, their sound heavy with finality. Then as the grave is filled, life resumes. The same hands that bury also gather wood, milk cows, feed fires. Because death was just one more task of winter. For medieval peasants, winter meant living side by side with death, not as an intruder, but as part of the season itself. For peasants trapped in the misery of a medieval winter, hope wasn't a luxury, it was survival, and that hope always pointed to one thing: spring. The first signs came quietly, a shift in the air, a faint drip of melting snow from the thatched roof, the song of a bird long absent, after months of silence broken only by howls, coughs and groans. That bird song felt like a miracle. Families paused to listen, their hearts lifted even as their bellies still growled with hunger. Snow retreated reluctantly, leaving behind mud and filth. The village reeked of rot, dead animals thawing, waste that had piled in corners, corpses buried shallowly in frozen earth. But peasants greeted the stench almost with joy. It meant life was returning, fields would open, and the cruel fist of winter was loosening. Work began immediately. Men stumbled into fields with weak bodies, turning soil despite their exhaustion. Women planted with trembling hands, sowing what little seed remained. Children carried water, scattering before the first shoots of green. Every moment counted. One mistake could mean famine again. The earth had to be coaxed back into life before the hunger killed what winter had spared. Spring was also a spiritual rebirth. Festivals erupted with relief. Candlemas, Easter, May Day, all became wild celebrations after the silence of winter. Bonfires blazed on hills, dances circled through thawing fields, songs lifted into warming skies. People feasted on whatever fresh food appeared. Wild greens, early herbs, milk flowing again from animals. After months of mouldy bread and salted meat, the taste of something green was ecstasy. Yet spring also revealed scars. Families counted their dead. Graves thawed and bones sometimes shifted in the softening earth. Empty huts stood as reminders of those who hadn't survived. Villages, smaller, weaker, but still alive, stumbled forward. The survivors carried both grief and gratitude. And there was a strange truth. Winter had hardened them. Those who endured came out tougher, more resilient, bound by shared suffering. Children who survived grew into adults who remembered the hunger, the cold, the silence. And they told those stories for generations. Warnings and lessons etched into memory. Imagine it. You stand in a muddy field, the sun warm on your face for the first time in months. Birds chatter overhead. Your stomach still aches with hunger. Your clothes hang loose from weight lost, but you feel alive. Behind you, smoke rises from huts, not choking and heavy but thin, sweet with new bread, baking in the communal oven. Around you, villagers murmur prayers of thanks, faces lined with both sorrow and relief. Winter had been merciless, as it always was, but you survived. And in that survival, spring felt like nothing short of resurrection. For medieval peasants, winter was the executioner, but spring was the reprieve, and the fragile, fleeting hope of those green shoots pushing through thawing soil was enough to keep them enduring the cold year after year. When you think back on it, medieval winter wasn't just a season. It was a trial, an executioner, a gauntlet that claimed thousands every year. For the peasants trapped in smoky huts, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about clawing through the cold, the hunger, the filth, and the darkness long enough to glimpse spring's fragile light. We've walked through it together, the fires choking families with smoke, even as they saved them from freezing. The food that rotted in cellars, or stretched into loaves so bitter they barely counted as bread. The sickness, that turned every cough into a death sentence. We've seen how families slept pressed against animals, trading stench for warmth, and how wolves circled huts at night, waiting for weakness. We've seen children cough themselves to death, parents chew leather to trick their stomachs, neighbours turn to theft, and in the darkest years, even cannibalism whispered in snowbound silence. This wasn't the winter of Christmas cards and cosy hearths. It was filth, despair, and endurance. And every peasant who survived to see spring carried scars on their bodies, in their bellies, in their memories. And yet, survival meant more than misery. It meant strength. Those who lived through medieval winters came out forged like iron. They passed down not just stories, but resilience. For them, spring wasn't just a change of weather. It was proof of endurance, proof that even in the cruelest of seasons, life could claw its way forward. So as you sit warm in your room tonight, maybe sipping tea or lying under soft blankets, take a moment. Listen to the hum of your heater, the buzz of your light, the silence of the night outside, and then imagine a world where that hum was replaced by howling wolves, where that blanket was damp wool crawling with lice, where the air itself made your lungs burn with smoke. That was normal for the majority of people who ever lived. It's shocking, it's grotesque, it's miserable, but it's also the truth. And if you made it this far, thank you for staying with me through the dirtiest corners of history. If you enjoyed this journey, I'd appreciate a like or a subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these late night dives into the past. And in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. It never stops amazing me that people drift to sleep with these stories all over the world. Now, dim the lights, pull your blanket tighter, and let yourself be grateful. Grateful for warmth, for food, for clean water, for a winter that doesn't want you dead. Because for the peasants of medieval Europe, every winter was a battle with death itself. And every spring wasn't just a season, it was a resurrection,